Hello, I am Daniel Innerarity. I hold the chair of political philosophy, and I am a professor at the European Institute of France. I'm going to talk to you about the relationship between algorithm governance and AI and democracy. It is one of the most concerning topics right now in political and academic debates on digitalization. Many things are being discussed, but probably this is a topic about which we need more reflection because there are many doomsday statements according to which artificial intelligence is going to wipe out what we have in terms of democracy, and on the other hand, artificial agenda is also, posing some legislative objectivity and efficacy expectations. In my opinion, very excessive. I'm going to try to address this topic to try to say what it is useful for, what it is not useful for, the limits of the possibilities of artificial intelligence and algorithm governance for the life of our democracies and the future of our democracies. I'm going to try to address three issues. Firstly, I'm going to tell you what the algorithm governance means. Secondly, whether that makes us help us understand that we are in the framework of a real algorithm democracy or not. And then I will address the topic of equality in terms of democracy, that is, that all of us have the same right to be protagonists of our destiny and the decisions that affect us, whether that is complied with in the framework of artificial intelligence, up to what extent, or not at all. So I will cover all these topics in 3/4 of an hour, and I will try to provide something to the debate. I am really sorry I cannot be there in person because, we could have had a posterior debate, but it was impossible for me to make it, to be there. Governing, it is, and it will be more so in the future, an algorithm act. It is a wishful thinking to think that we can address the great challenges in terms of technological governance, climatic crisis, forecast of the future, knowledge of society, etc., if we do not have tools that also help us with the artificial intelligence technologies, the algorithms, machine learning, so forth. Some people talk about algocracy to design this system in which algorithms are used to collect and organize data. And on the basis of that data collection and analysis, some decisions are made in an automatic way because of the systems that adopt those decisions. The scope of decision systems led by algorithms and data means that machines support human beings in the decision-making process and also replace them, partially or completely, depending on the topics and depending on the issues that allowed for that replacement, or whether that is only a complementarity. And that is the heart of the discussion. But we have to think or wonder up to what extent the use of automated decision systems is compatible with the democratic principle by which we think that a political system, in terms of decision-making process, is a system that is based on the free decisions of human beings, and therefore the subcontracting of machines that do not control it. This is the concerning topic. What is the meaning of massive introduction of decision procedures of automated management for the governmental action? This is in line with the regulatory framework of democracy. The great promise of this technology is that it allows us to know the will, the real will of people. That is one of the great advantages of this world full of sensors, algorithms, data, smart objects that make up a kind of a social sensor that allow us to customize health, transport, or energy. We all have experience about this. I do not need to give you many examples. Thanks to these technologies, we are in a granular understanding, a detailed understanding, segmented, micro-segmented understanding of individual interactions, and therefore systems that are more capable to respond to individual needs. Algorithm systems are also useful to classify individuals, to foresee their preferences, to know what they really want on the basis of a huge amount of data we have and that are doubled every little time. The increase of data we have. Another thing is how they are organized, interpreted, managed, shared. But the mere quantity of data is huge, is incredible. In fact, the business model of many digital businesses is based on the fact that they know their users better than they know themselves. And on the basis of their behavior, how they foresee their behavior, they offer them the appropriate product timely. There is a kind of comfortable paternalism in algorithm societies that consists of the fact that we are given what we want and that it rules with provided incentives, they give us what we want, etc., etc. Well, with a superficial approach, this is not a problem, but what would happen if we transfer this model to politics? Well, it would not pose any big problem with having those ideologized parties. But what would happen if we had an algorithm systems that did something similar? Well, what happens is that this is usually done in detriment of some other personal freedom. Therefore, taking this into account, there is a concerning discrepancy between self-determination that we demand and we want to protect. I self-determine myself, I decide, we decide, nobody decides on our behalf. That is core to the value of democracy, but that enters into conflict, light or deep, with the fact that we are ready to renounce partially or totally to this when there are provisions. The result of it all is that the satisfaction of our needs is usually done in detriment of freedom spaces, and that should be concerning. What would be then the democratic value of these data, recommendations, predictions that are done through algorithm governance systems? We have to take into account that this poses problems because they are just our free decisions of the past. If I have bought myself a bottle of wine, a pair of shoes, or I have gone on holiday to the Isles to spend the summer, there's nothing wrong with the fact that an algorithm system deducts that I like wine, I like traveling to the Isles, etc., etc. But of course, if someone thinks this is not concerning, they may say, well, this is just suggestions, propositions, on the basis of what the machines understand it has been our wish or our preferences, free preferences in the past. From this point of view, there would be no conflict between big data and democracy, but rather the contrary. But in my opinion, the problem lies in the fact that democracy is not the immediate translation and aggregated translation, of what we decide individually. The dynamic nature transforming the nature of democratic life includes a changing element, a discovery element, if you wish, that sometimes it is in open breach with the past. I think that AI currently is not proper to implement that transformation will. The problem in terms of algorithms in this regard is that most of algorithm forecasts are based on the idea that the future will be very similar to the past, or as similar as possible. That is, usually we have bought cigarettes, we will continue buying cigarettes, when maybe all of a sudden we decide to give up smoking. That is to say, algorithms tend to think that our future preferences will be a continuum of our previous behavior, as it is recorded in the data in terms of our mobility, consumption of social media. Well, there is a political dimension that is not a continuum with regard to the past, and that is fundamental. I am referring to the political dimension that does not only aim at reflecting what there is, but rather change part of the things with certain intention. In the past, we called it revolution. Now we call it transformation, change, alternative, political innovation, you name it. Maybe the most unsatisfactory element of this massive use of data is that they are not revolutionary at all. Apparently, it is a revolution, but it is not revolutionary at all. The data analysis acts as a recording device. It registers what we do, but it has many, many huge difficulties when identifying what in that reality recorded there is in terms of wish, contradiction, or insatisfaction. I'll give you an example. If machines had managed the production of jokes, we would still be laughing at chauvinist jokes with a certain chauvinist nature, as we used to do in the 30s or 40s. There has been an intentional change in the society, a change in terms of taste, moral, and now those jokes are not funny anymore. So there has been a decision, there has been an intentional change to break with that continuum. Moreover, if we want to take freedom seriously, it is also part of our freedom the wish to modify what we have been. And therefore, it is part of human freedom the possibility of giving way to new situations, sometimes radically new, unforeseen by a system that anticipates the future, as it is the algorithm systems. I think the algorithms that are referred to as predictive algorithms are very conservative. They are predictive because they formulate the hypothesis that our future will be a reproduction of our past, but they do not include the subjectivity of persons and societies, where there are also wishes, ambitions, breaches, changes, etc., etc. The question is, how do we want to understand deep reality of our societies if we do not introduce in our analysis, as well as the behaviors of consumers, for example, the huge asymmetries in terms of powers, injustices in this world, or how that vector of breach, that vector of insatisfaction with the state of things, how is that introduced in a procedure of future algorithm projection in which the raw matter is the state of things, precisely the data that state of things provides and feeds big data continuously? Therefore, my conclusion in this first section is the following. Algorithmic governance is not a threat to democracy because it conditions our present decisions, but rather because it ignores our future decisions. It does not smell them. It does not understand them. Democracy is not about doing what we want, but rather being able to change what we want, change ourselves. Do really algorithms know our deep will or only the shallow dimension? Routines, rather. Politics is not a mere continuous administration of the past, but rather the open possibility to breach with the inertia of the past. And I think algorithms do not have that power because they make predictions with any other reference to the past. How do we refer our objectives so that machines do not have to do anything but rather pursue them efficiently? This is a different approach. Are we sure that what we want now is what we want in the future? Machine learning algorithms may anticipate our future projections and threaten us so that we do not make alternative futures. Susanna Tumos formulated this trend when she mentioned that in the digital age, what is at stake is a right to the future, a fundamental right. Second item I wanted to address, up to what extent can we, describe it as a democracy? For what aspects of democracy could it be useful or could it be limited? As you know, Alan Turing, the founder of the artificial intelligence, as we know it, described the computer as a universal machine. The idea of a universal machine does not mean that a computer can be used for everything and for everything and for every time and for every process we are involved in or with. My starting thesis is that when talking about the political process and democratic processes, there are aspects and parts in which this universal machine can help us a lot. But it can be useful for many other things. It is not sufficient when managing, ruling the most relevant parts of democracy. Algorithm governance is very appropriate to rule some aspects of the political process, but it is useless for other processes or aspects. It may correct deficiencies, human biases. It can make the conversation very objective. It may be used to identify individual preferences, to measure impacts of legislative decisions, but it is very limited if we wish to address those political dimensions that cannot be computed, namely those areas that are not easily quantified, that is, for the democratic moment when the criteria objectives are designed, those objectives to be optimized by technology later on. The reason why algorithms are politically limited lies in the instrumental nature. Algorithms are useful to reach predetermined objectives, but they are useless when determining those objectives because this is a task of political will, reflection, democratic debate. The role of politics, the political role of politics, is precisely to decide the design of strategies of algorithm optimization and to have the possibility of modify them in changing environments. In democracy, everything has to be open to repoliticization. That is the possibility of questioning the objectives set before or the priorities we set before. But to do so, algorithms are hardly useful. The algorithm government does not have a capacity to solve political conflicts, or if you wish, the political dimension of those conflicts. That is to say, when what is at stake is the frameworks, the aims, and the values. And North American anthropologist Lucy Salzman mentioned something I liked very much. Robots act very well when the world has been organized in the way it should have been organized. And I conclude by saying, okay, and who organizes the world as such? The human beings with the help of the machines, but there is a human element, political, and it is not algorithm, it is not a technological element. Algorithm governance aims at fulfilling objectives that have not been discussed, or once they stopped being discussed, and that same governance does not establish those objectives or cannot question them. But democratic politics is not a mere information processing, but rather interpretation of information in a framework of pluralism. It is not about fulfilling certain objectives or achieving them, but rather about deciding those objectives. Machines help us to achieve objectives, but they do not help us to establish the political objectives we wish for our society. Thus, the problem resolution of an administrative nature is very important, but it is very different from politics understood as a conflict of interpretation in the framework of reality. It is not a matter of optimizing results, but rather establishing them. There is a huge difference between how algorithm systems learn and how democratic decisions are made. Automatic systems, the decision automatic systems, what do they do? Well, they process information to achieve objectives the best way they can. What does democratic politics do? Democratic politics does not try to optimize predefined objectives, but rather to find out those objectives. So the political sphere starts where we have to start discussing the values to be fulfilled. And that is where the political value starts. There is an everyday example between this, in this difference between defining objectives and implementing objectives. And that has to do with the following, and I am referring to the common place according to which we should not care about who rules, whether it is of the right or the left, but rather that that person manages well. Sometimes we have heard, well, I do not care who governs, left or right. What I want is that that person manages well, as if managing well as if the decision about a good or bad management could be assessed or could be established without taking into account ideologies. Good or bad are not neutral adjectives, but rather the contrary. Well, this topic is only possible to the extent that left and right are not what they used to be, and as rigid categories, they explain very little. But usually, those who defend this idea usually wishes not a ideologized politics, but rather depolarized politics, which is rather different. As it usually happens in politics, when we talk about algorithm governance, the idea of producing better decisions with the help of machines requires that previously there is a criteria regarding a good decision. It is true that artificial intelligence is used to feed decisions, to optimize results, but some economists have tried to quantify and measure the aggregated well-being. There is not a predefined notion, an unquestionable notion regarding a satisfactory result in politics. We all want a satisfactory result, but what is a satisfactory result? Well, that definition will vary depending on who is judging that result. This is the political dimension of society. Democracy is a political system. I like to insist on this fact that starts from the ignorance regarding a good decision, that distrusts or suspects that someone can know it, and therefore it implements some learning processes to overcome that barrier. We have democracy, we have a political debate, we have parliaments, although sometimes it may seem a lie, to try to figure out what a good politic is or a good policy. And later on, we will implement it, measuring it with the help of machines, etc., etc. So the sense of mediation institutions in a democracy consists of establishing a common basis between an immediate will and political decision. My immediate will is expressed by the way I behave, act, and then we have the political decision. Institutions are something that mediate between those two realities, and what political institutions, and especially the deliberative ones, open up a space so that it is possible the acceleration of decisions to allow for the free exchange of opinions and points of view. We stop the world for a sec and we say, okay, we're going to discuss this matter. We're going to weigh, value whether our interests are well identified and they are compatible with others' interests, etc., etc. We can reach agreements, so on and so forth. That is a fundamental part of democratic life, probably one of the most important ones, and one of the parts that has been most damaged by our political system. So usually, or sometimes, these interests enter into conflict. I'd like to refer to a distinction pointed out by Uzwe between the will of everybody and the general will, because I think that algorithm democracy, that is the democracy that measures, identifies, analyzes a huge amount of data on the basis of our behavior, is the will of everybody, that is an addition, and not so much a general will. Rousseau used to say, for example, something reflexive that was built on the basis of some reflection. Our preferences are taken into consideration, of course. But in principle is our will, our aim, our ambition, our interests. But in the algorithm democracy, we are deprived of that deliberative construction element. All of a sudden, those preferences are not added, but rather they interact with others through dialogue, debate, and sometimes even in a conflictive way. The problem of algorithm governance is that thanks to algorithms we have generated with our data, we intervene in the expression of preferences and interests. These are my data, these are my preferences and my interests. But we have no possibility of intervening in the construction of the social totality of preferences. And therefore, we cannot modify it because the mere addition of wills and interests can result in terrible results. I am thinking about the climatic change. The climatic crisis, the result of the addition of behaviors in an isolated way, well, they are not very relevant, but altogether, yes. And probably what we have learned in recent years is that the fact that I buy one or another product, I use the car in one another way, has some global results. So my specific immediate preference can and should be limited, taking into account an aggregate totality of the preferences of all. An algorithm is not aware of this fact because it is not very reflective. In an algorithm democracy, the fact of being a citizen would only consist of the fact of, well, expressing wishes, and that's it. But I would not have the right to weigh those wishes or look into the compatibility of those wishes and the wishes of the others. The great promise of algorithm governance lies in the fact that optimal results, the satisfaction of those needs, makes us forget the procedures that can be wished. It is a kind of governance that may prefer effectiveness even in detriment of being excluded from the decision-making process. Or, for example, that our presence in the decision-making process is a minimum. It is an individual implicit presence, for example, just by formulating our preferences in terms of consumption, mobility, or statements in social media. But if citizenship cannot supervise or control somehow political algorithms, we cannot call it self-government. We can call it self-government of individuals, but not self-government of the people, because the people is not being conformed. Of course, results of the government are very important, but what defines democracy is rather the procedure and not the result. Democratic government does not mean that they are going to provide results or outputs, but rather guarantee certain inputs, and more specifically, those inputs that ensure that the equal liberty or freedom of all citizens to take part in the decision-making processes. Algorithm governance can be democratic when the objectives and procedures have been expressly authorized by the people in an act of political nature. This governance, in my opinion, has three weaknesses from a democratic point of view. First, that we think that when issuing digital signals, we have already expressed what we want. Secondly, that we have done it without interiorizing expressly the compatibility of our will with that of the others, which is not in the line with the democratic values. And thirdly, that do we not take into account the heterodetermination. of this process. So a governance that seems to be legitimate because it does not impose itself, I think that sometimes, well, we may be concerned about the conditions in which that satisfaction has been achieved. And the last topic I want to address that has to do with democratic equality. Democracy is born as a promise to satisfy the ambition of equality and a very specific type of equality, equality in terms of the capacity of everybody when influencing the decisions that affect us. Institutions such as the universal vote, participation, representation, freedom of association, freedom of expression or speech. Most of the institutions of democracy have that role, that is to ensure as much as possible that equality, that we all have the same capacity or power to influence in those decisions that affect us all. This is a legislative norm, if you wish. Sometimes it is complied with and sometimes not. What's the problem? Well, when the digital sphere has been constructed as a sphere of political will, the question regarding what equality is possible in this scenario has been very controversial. Maybe because we do not have a historical perspective or we have very little conceptualization. The fact is that we don't have a framework of categories that tell us about the nature of the digital space. The interpretations that have been proposed so far can be well, broken down into three versions of the digital governance on the basis on the articulation of interactions between subjects in a society. Agora, market, and hierarchy. The agora is the horizontal and open communication. Market is the information system that structures the prices, and bureaucracy is an institutional way to assign decisions. Equality in each of these interpretations would be, and respectively, a value guaranteed by the open nature in a digital space, by the similarity with the market, where there is a sovereign consumer with any barrier, or the result of that equality in which the result is a certain action of the government that intervenes and rules. What should we do? Should we think that democratization is a business, a matter of power? To a great extent, the great geostrategic decisions, Europe, United States, China, answer in an affirmative way to each of these possibilities of interpretation. My proposal starts with a reflection. We cannot democratize authority in a digital space if we do not know what type of authority that is. We have to question whether it is an agora in which domination has been replaced by neutrality and nobody rules, or if we are facing a market of preferences, or if we are facing a bureaucracy that administers with efficacy and justice. Who is the sovereign here? The digital sovereign, the algorithm, the consumer, or the state? We should address three topics. The first one addresses the algorithm neutrality. The digital space is a horizontal sphere and free of domination. There are only suggestions, satisfaction of demands that implicitly are expressed by our digital footprint. The AI and the algorithm governance systems work on the basis of a logic that is very similar to democratic individualism, but in my opinion, it is altered, and we need to understand this to assess the legitimacy. The fact that they are systems to identify and satisfy our preferences does not mean that they stick to characteristics of every individual or subject, but rather they adapt to characteristics of footprints of the group that some individuals share with others, so it is not exactly the same. In this pathway between the individual and what the individuals share with others, usually there is an alteration that usually acquires the nature of discriminatory biases. The fact of satisfying the pattern in which an individual fits in is not the same as satisfying an individual. Examining groups of populations and creating profiles offers huge possibilities for exclusion and manipulation. Of course, and I highlight this, we are not facing here a manipulating observer, but rather a banal mechanism of discrimination that promises neutrality, but that can not always guarantee it because of the circumstances linked to algorithm logic. Algorithms have a political dimension as long as they intervene in the social order and the structure of decisions. When we say that something has a political nature, we are referring to two contradictory things. That is, that there is a lot of politics and that there is little politics. That there is a lot of politics in algorithms, I mean that they are exercising some kind of authority that only corresponds to politics, and they make up the social reality as only politics is authorized to do. That there is little politics means that they have to be politicized, that is, they have to be subject to the express political authorization procedures that have certain spaces in democracy. The second topic refers to the fact that sometimes we confuse the political logic with the logic of the market, and whether algorithm procedures can be subsumed to the consumption category. First of all, democracy is based on the principle of not giving in to the benevolence of authorities. If democracy is not, and this is my thesis, if democracy is not a provision of services or a delivery of services, then the citizen is not a satisfied client. Well, however, algorithm governance is a type of governance that treats citizens as consumers, and in the best of the cases, they validate the satisfaction of the preferences, or if they have not been asked for an opinion, they are valued on the basis of the satisfaction of the whole of the population. The so-defined algorithms, in my opinion, have a dispoliticizing effect. Algorithm logic dispolitizes as long as it neutralizes the questioning of that automatism that delivers our satisfaction, and therefore we do not question it. The advantages in terms of satisfaction of individual needs could be so tricksters that we cannot think of any alternative to that kind of governance. The third category to understand logic, the new digital space, is offered by bureaucracy and hierarchy categories, the third big category to interpret this topic. Could digital administration be a system that makes superfluous other types of self-organization of society, those that we qualify as democratic ones? Could we think of an algorithmic governance that would make unnecessary the ideological debates regarding concepts, principles, and values? Well, we should say yes to these questions if we understand that governing is an administrative task. And this is what I would like to question. Politics in democracy is not just an administrative task. Of course, administrative tasks are very, very important. But there is no sophisticated device to calculate or decide that can ignore or minimize the aims we wish to reach by implementing or using the management instruments. The politics is essential because although artificial intelligence can help us a lot, artificial intelligence cannot replace it. And we can see this in the fact that the technology does not dissolve controversies and does not guarantee simultaneous satisfaction of preferences or interests. Even wherever there is an agreement regarding the appropriateness of promoting equality, they do not share the same idea in terms of equality. Sometimes people are happy just with sharing the starting conditions, and other people understand equality as a similarity in terms of results. We also have a discussion in terms of formal or differentiated equality, how to articulate categories or groups of subjects to face discriminations in a society. As a way of conclusion, I would like to say that if in our society we had an agreement regarding the meaning of equality, then algorithms would develop a purely technical task. We would only have to find the best way to operationalize that idea of justice. The problem is that the idea of justice is a real democratic battlefield, a concept that is very controversial in any plural society. There are more disagreements regarding its values than the means to achieve those values. No technological device can do the job for us. That is to carry out democratic discussion regarding the goals, although it can facilitate us the task in terms of implementing the objectives that democratically, we have decided to pursue. Thank you very much for your attention.